Arnell, a security guard at an old building, was known for his toughness and fearlessness. One night, while patrolling the premises, he noticed an unusual silence. Unlike other nights, it felt as though there was a heavy presence around him. As he walked down the dark hallway, he heard the faint sound of footsteps, as if someone was following him. But when he looked back, no one was there. He quickened his pace, thinking it was just his fatigue. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, as if something unseen was behind him. As Arnell continued walking, he felt a cold breeze brush against his neck, even though there was no open window. It felt like a nightmare, but he tried to stay calm. He noticed the lights in the hallway flickering, as if something was moving through the cables. When he stopped in front of a door, he heard a faint whisper. Slowly, he leaned his ear toward the door and heard a name. Arnell. His heart began to race. He couldn't remember anyone being inside the building. He looked around, but there was no one. He checked his watch. It was 2 a.m. No other guards were on duty at that time. Suddenly, loud footsteps echoed from above, as though someone heavy was running. As the footsteps continued to rumble from above, Arnell noticed they seemed to be getting closer, as if something was descending from the second floor. He could feel the tension rising in his body. There was no one else in the building, and Arnell was the only guard at that hour. A single question came to his mind. Who could it be? He quickly walked toward the stairs, his eyes scanning every corner of the darkness. When he reached the top, he suddenly felt a cold wind brushing against his skin, followed by the loud sound of a door creaking from a room that had been unused for a long time. The silence of the night was unlike any other, but what Arnell felt was not silence. It was a presence, something he couldn't explain. He slowly opened the door to the room, and in the dark corners, he saw a strange shadow that seemed to move toward him. The darkness inside the room was so heavy, as if it carried a sinister energy that stoked Arnell's fear. As he stared at the shadow, a faint light began to glow from a small window, and there he saw a figure standing in the middle of the room. A woman in an old white gown, her long white hair messy, her eyes deep and lifeless. She stared at Arnell, her gaze piercing into his soul. The woman gave nothing but a cold stare that sent terror into Arnell's heart. Arnell. He heard his name again from a voice he couldn't pinpoint. He ran out of the room, but the door suddenly slammed shut in front of him, as though something was holding it closed. Panicked, he rushed back to the stairs, but as he ran, he felt hands brushing against his skin, cold fingers sending chills through his body. As Arnell ran down the stairs, the footsteps seemed to follow every movement he made. It was as though a presence was trying to grasp him. The lights in the hallway flickered, like a malevolent force was shifting their direction, and every sound around him was deafening. When he reached the bottom, he realized time seemed to stop. There was no sound from above, no footsteps. Arnell directed his flashlight around, but in every corner of the hallway, the darkness seemed to close in, more intense than before. In fear, he hurried to the guardhouse, but in the midst of his terror, he saw someone standing in front of the guardhouse, the woman he had seen earlier in the room. Her eyes twisted into a bitter smile. Arnell. Her voice seemed to come from his mind. Arnell couldn't take it anymore. Despite all his strength, fear took control of his body. He suddenly ran, but before he could get far, the whole place went dark, and in that instant, he vanished from everyone's sight. As Arnell continued running, he didn't realize that a new face had arrived at the building. Jonas, a young guard who had just started working there, passed through the entrance and noticed the unusual silence. He was unaware of the events inside the building and the stories of the old guards who had long since left. He quickly entered and saw the guardhouse, seemingly abandoned. He didn't see Arnell, but he sensed a strange presence. As he walked down the dark hallway, he felt something following him, so he immediately looked around. Like Arnell, Jonas also heard the footsteps above, but what was strange was that he saw doors that had been opened, doors that had been closed for a long time. When he saw the room in disarray, he felt as though something was watching him from the dark corner. He turned around, and there he saw a figure blinking and staring at him. It was Arnell. Behind you. Arnell's voice was sad and weak. She's there. Jonas walked toward Arnell, but as he got closer, Arnell suddenly disappeared before his eyes. To Jonas's shock, the building's doors suddenly began closing quickly, as though an invisible force was controlling them. Jonas froze in place. The cold wind seemed to pierce his skin, and the silence screamed in his ears. He tried calling Arnell on the radio, but only static came through. Amid the noise, a voice suddenly appeared. "Help me!" Jonas wasn't sure if it was Arnell's voice or someone else's. Instead of leaving, he decided to find out what was going on. He grabbed his flashlight and slowly followed the footsteps that echoed from the second floor. As he climbed, a woman suddenly appeared in front of him, his old colleague from another building. Ailing Marta, the cleaning lady. But what was strange was that it had been months since he was told that ailing Marta had died in an accident. "Ma'am, Marta," he stuttered, but the woman didn't answer. She just stared at him, smiling coldly. Jonas grew uneasy as the woman approached him, until he noticed that her feet weren't touching the ground. She was floating. In the middle of the tension, Jonas suddenly felt a hand pulling him from behind. When he turned, he saw Arnold standing there, sweating and clearly terrified. "Jonas, run! Don't look!" Arnold shouted, pulling him down the stairs. But before they could get far, they heard the cold, spine-chilling voice again. "You won't escape. You're one of us now." As Arnell dragged Jonas down the stairs, the footsteps behind them grew faster and louder. It was as if a group of people was following them, but when Jonas looked back, he saw nothing, except for shadows moving on the wall. "Big brother Arnell, what is this?" Jonas shouted, struggling to keep running. "This building is cursed," Arnell whispered, "and no matter what we do, we won't leave here easily." When they reached the guardhouse, they quickly locked the door and secured all the windows. But while Jonas was adjusting his gun, he suddenly noticed that the air had become heavier. The surroundings were unnervingly quiet, as though time had stopped. Unexpectedly, Jonas's radio crackled. Once again, the static was replaced by a cold voice. "You can't escape. This is our home." Suddenly, they saw the CCTV monitors start to move. On one screen, they saw the woman in the white gown standing in the hallway near the stairs. But what was more terrifying was that, with each passing second, it seemed like she was getting closer to the camera, until her lifeless eyes were almost visible on the screen. Jonas began to lose control. "Big brother, what are we going to do? We can't stay here much longer." But before Arnold could answer, all the lights went out. The whole area went dark, and they felt that they were no longer alone in the room. In the darkness, a voice they could clearly hear came from the side. "Don't be afraid. You'll stay here, with us." In the darkness, Jonas felt a cold breath brush against his ear. He swallowed hard and gripped his gun tightly, but his hands were shaking with fear. Arnell, on the other hand, remained silently staring at the door, as though waiting for something. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from outside the guardhouse, followed by scratching sounds on the walls. "Jonas, no matter what happens, don't open the door," Arnell said firmly. But before they could figure out what to do next, the CCTV monitors suddenly turned back on, even though there was no power in the building. On the screen, they saw someone else in the building, a man dressed in a security guard's uniform, but Jonas didn't recognize him. "Big brother, who is that? Is there someone else on duty here?" Jonas asked, his voice trembling. "That's Danny, the former guard here," Arnell replied, barely able to look at the screen. "But he's been missing. 4 years ago. He was one of the first." He didn't finish his sentence. On the monitor, they saw Danny seemingly searching the hallways, but with each step he took, his appearance slowly changed. His uniform became torn, and his face was covered in cuts and blood. Danny stopped in front of the camera and stared at them, as though he knew they were watching. Suddenly, the door of the guardhouse started to move, as though someone was trying to open it from the outside. "Don't pay attention to it," Arnell said. "Just keep your eyes shut." But Jonas didn't listen. He stood up and approached the door, even as it kept banging. "Big brother, maybe there's really someone outside." He tried reaching for the lock, but before he could touch it, a hand from behind stopped him. When he turned, he saw Danny's face, standing inside the guardhouse. "Now, buddy, you know why they never leave here," Danny said, his voice sounding like both a human and a ghost at the same time. Jonas stopped, and Danny's cold eyes were fixed on him. He couldn't move, as if an invisible force was holding him in place. On the other hand, Arnell stepped back, clearly afraid, but trying to control himself. "Jonas, don't listen to him," Arnell shouted. "He's not human. He's been dead for a long time." Danny suddenly smiled, a smile full of sadness and anger. "You're right, Arnell. I'm dead. But that doesn't mean it's all over for me," he said as he slowly approached Jonas. With every step Danny took, Jonas felt the weight of the air around him. The shadows in the corners of the guardhouse moved, and they seemed to form into shapes that looked familiar to him. "Do you know why I disappeared, Jonas?" Danny asked, bringing his face closer to Jonas. "Because, like you, I believed I could leave this place. But this building, it doesn't let anyone leave without a price." "What do you mean?" Jonas asked, his voice trembling. Danny laughed, a sound like tearing paper and shattered glass. "The curse of this building is alive. It needs souls. And once you're here, you become part of its life. But if you want to survive, you have to choose. One of us has to be left behind." Jonas stared at Danny and then looked at Arnell, who was now holding his gun. "Jonas," Arnell said, "don't let the curse consume you. Fight back." But before Jonas could decide, the shadows began to move faster, turning into hands that tried to pull him and Arnell in. Amid the chaos, they heard Danny's voice again, a whisper that pierced their ears. "Only one can leave. Who will you choose, Jonas?" As the shadows pulled at Jonas and Arnell, they struggled to break free, but the smoky hands were too strong. Danny's cold voice echoed in the room. "Who will you choose, Jonas? Only one can survive." Jonas, nearly suffocating from fear, looked at Arnell. "Big brother, what should we do?" "I can't do this," he almost begged. But Arnell remained firm, although fear was evident on his face. "Jonas, we don't have to play into his trap," Arnell replied, holding his gun. "Don't believe him. This curse feeds on fear. We can fight it, but you have to trust me." But before Jonas could speak, he felt the shadows pulling him even harder. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Danny getting closer, his face becoming more twisted, like a being no longer human. "You can't escape, Jonas," Danny said. "Unless you choose. Leave Arnell and you can go. The building needs you." In desperation, Jonas looked at Arnell, who seemed to be preparing himself for whatever would come next. "Jonas," Arnell said, "if you have to choose, I'll sacrifice myself. You're younger. You have a family waiting." "Big brother, no. I won't leave you," Jonas cried as he struggled against the shadows. But as he watched Danny, he noticed something strange. His eyes, though full of anger, seemed to be asking for help. "Arnold, Jonas, I don't want anything but for this to end," Danny suddenly said. "This building brought me its curse, and now I am its instrument. I'm not your enemy. It's this place. But there's a way to end it. A soul has to be offered." Jonas and Arnell fell silent. The shadows stopped moving, as if waiting for their next move. "Danny, what do you mean?" Arnell asked. "I can sacrifice myself," Danny said, his voice becoming clearer. "But you have to help me. Take me back to the room where it all started. There, the curse will end." Jonas and Arnell exchanged glances, both confused and afraid of what Danny had said. The idea of returning to the room where it all began seemed impossible. But if that was the only way to end the curse, they had no other choice. "If we do this, Danny, how can we be sure the curse will end?" Arnell asked, still holding his gun and watching every movement around them. "This curse lives in fear, anger, and sorrow," Danny explained. "If you take me back to the room, I'll lose my connection to this place. But as soon as we try, this building will do everything to stop us." Jonas and Arnell decided to take the risk. Despite their fear, They helped Danny get up from the floor. He no longer looked human. His form was disjointed, but they could still see the desperation in his eyes to escape the curse. As they walked back to the second floor, the walls of the building seemed alive. The doors opened and closed by themselves, and the windows were covered with thick darkness. Their footsteps echoed loudly throughout the building, as if countless eyes were watching them. Finally, they reached the room, the same room where they had first seen the woman in the white gown. The door was slightly ajar, but inside was a cold light that seemed unnatural. "Why does it feel brighter here?" Jonas asked, holding the flashlight that now seemed unnecessary. "This place is the heart of the building," Danny answered. "This is where its first sacrifice took place. And now, I'll end the curse here." As they entered the room, they felt the air grow heavier. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and they heard the cold voice of the woman again. "Did you think you could leave? The curse doesn't end. It's only just beginning." As the door closed, the entire room seemed to be enveloped in an inexplicable energy. The cold light became brighter, but it was coming from the floor, where there was a large circle with an engraving of a strange symbol. In the center of the circle, Danny stood, as if pulled by an invisible force. "It's time," Danny said, slowly looking at Jonas and Arnell. "Once I begin this, I can't go back. I need to stay here to fully end the curse. But you need to hurry. This building will try to take you both." Suddenly, the surroundings became loud. The walls of the room began to crack, and from the broken parts, shadows started to emerge. They grew bolder, taking the shapes of people, former guards, workers, and other unknown creatures, all clearly victims of the curse. "Big brother, what do we do?" Jonas shouted as he tried to push away the approaching shadows. "Protect Danny," Arno replied, still holding his gun and trying to shoot at the shadows, though the bullets seemed ineffective. As Danny began to chant prayers or offerings, the circle on the floor grew brighter. His body slowly turned to smoke, as if being absorbed by the circle. "I need to offer what's left of me," he said, his voice becoming fainter. "When I'm gone, the power of this building will be gone." But amid his sacrifice, they felt the strength of the shadows increase. One of them lunged at Jonas, and he nearly dropped his flashlight. Arnold, summoning all his courage, rushed to save Jonas and pushed the shadows away. "Danny, hurry!" Arnell shouted, sweating heavily as he fought off the countless beings. Suddenly, the woman's voice was heard again, louder and angrier. "You can't escape! This curse is part of everyone who enters here!" But Danny, with his last strength, screamed, "No more! Now I will end this!" The light from the circle became so bright it seemed to explode, and the shadows suddenly vanished. The woman's voice was cut off. In an instant, all the noise disappeared, and the surroundings became silent. When Jonas opened his eyes, he saw that Danny was gone. The circle on the floor had disappeared, and the room seemed like an ordinary space. "Big brother, is it over?" Jonas asked Arnell, almost unable to believe. "I think, yes," Arnell answered, still panting. But before they could leave the room, they noticed that the building seemed to be collapsing. The walls started to crumble, and the ceiling cracked. "We need to get out of here, Jonas," Arnell shouted. As the building started to collapse, Arnell quickly pulled Jonas out of the room. Each step was accompanied by the sound of falling debris, as if the entire place was falling apart after losing its power to hold them back. "Jonas, hurry! We don't have time!" Arnell shouted as he kicked open a door to get through. In the hallway, they noticed that the emergency exit signs were flickering again, something that hadn't worked since they entered the building. "Let's go there," Arnell said, pointing to the stairs down. As they descended, Jonas heard Danny's voice again, but now it wasn't cold or frightening. It was like a voice of farewell. "Jonas, Arnell, thank you for your help. The curse is over. But remember, don't ever come back here." When they reached the ground floor, they felt the floor becoming unstable. The main entrance doors, which had been closed and barred earlier, suddenly opened as if helping them escape. They continued to run until they were outside the building. As they stood outside, they saw the building from a distance. It seemed to be breathing, each wall moving before slowly collapsing. The entire structure suddenly fell, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the sound of crumbling cement and steel. Breathing heavily and covered in sweat, Jonas and Arnell sat on the road, far from the ruins of the building. They stared at the once terrifying place, which was now just a pile of debris. In their silence, Jonas spoke again. "Big brother, is it really over? Is the curse really gone?" he asked, still struggling to believe everything that had happened. "I think so, yes," Arnell answered, staring at the place where the building had fallen. "But what matters is we're safe, and Danny, he did what needed to be done." In the distance, they heard vehicles approaching. Police and fire trucks, wondering how an entire building had disappeared in the middle of the night. But for Jonas and Arnell, it didn't matter what they would say. What mattered was that they survived, and the curse was over. But despite everything, as they walked away, Jonas couldn't help but look back at the place. At the top of the rubble, he saw what looked like a shadow watching them. A familiar figure, Danny, smiling and raising his hand as if saying goodbye.